Welcome to the Rob Seco Field Ready Podcast with your host, Jim Robinson.
Hello, and welcome back to the Rob Seco Field Ready Podcast. I'm your host, Jim Robinson. It's time to take a look back at the 2020 growing season and those factors that influenced this year's crop. We saw a little bit of everything in 2020, and to help us to walk through this year, we have Wayne Fithian joining us. Welcome, Wayne.
Good morning, Jim.
Yeah, well, it's been a while since we've had you back on the show. It's good to have you back now.
Yeah, and it's always fun to talk about the growing season and what it did to the plants that were out there trying to survive the weather that they were confronted with.
Absolutely. So could you, first of all, tell us, as a whole, how do you describe 2020? Just a high-level view initially.
Well, most years, I'm not going to start with 2020. I'm going to kind of start, I guess, with a historical perspective, because most years you have, even though the Rob Seco footprint has gotten pretty large, usually we have one dominant weather factor that influences the crop kind of across the whole area. And 2020 was different in that, depending on where you lived in the Rob Seco footprint, the year was quite different, and the major weather events that really influenced the crop were quite different. So I call 2020 an interesting year, because from an agronomist perspective, there was about everything to watch that could have happened. We had really ultra early planting. We had people that in the end had to take prevent plant. We had areas that suffered significant drought damage, and we had areas that had near perfect rainfall. I mean, never too wet, really seldom, even on the dry side, what I would call about perfect rainfall. We had a lot of areas that didn't see much wind damage, but we had areas that, wind damage was the story of the growing season.
What about insects? I mean, did we see a lot of disease or insects this year?
Well, Jim, we didn't really see very much disease pressure other than in some of the better rainfall areas where we did have some sudden death syndrome in soybeans. For the most part, we had a pretty low disease pressure year in both corn and soybeans. We didn't see a lot of Lepidoptera insect pest pressure, so the moths, the black cutworm, the dingy cutworm, the corn borer, the western bean. We didn't see corn earworm. We just didn't have a lot of pressure from those insects. But corn rootworm had a really good year, and we had significant activity with corn rootworm larvae feeding on roots during early vegetative stages, or I should say early mid-vegetative stages, and then we saw quite a bit of beetle pressure as the crop came into the reproductive stages and tasseled. So we had a lot of beetle activity. And, even the end of the season was quite varied, because we had areas that were impacted by an early freeze. In some cases, that freeze even came with snow, and we had crops that were killed well ahead of of when they would have been ready for a fall frost. And we had other areas right here in Omaha. Our frost was nearly 3 weeks late. So we had areas that had to deal with an early freeze and areas that had quite late freezes.
Definitely makes for an interesting year. Absolutely. So, with that kind of high level overview, overall, I think we started the year with a pretty, about as ideal, other than some geographies up in the Dakotas and northwest Minnesota. And we kind of had an ideal spring, the good soil moisture, good weather for planting. I mean, how early would you say planting got finished, compared to a normal year?
Yeah, we really did. We got out to a quick start across almost the entire area. We were cool, but we were dry. And even the areas that got some rain were just kind of on normal in terms of May precipitation. Late April was fairly dry, so we had a really quick start to planting. And both the corn and the beans in very large areas of our footprint were planted very timely and got in good. And the other thing that we all started out with was a really full soil profile. So we had a lot of moisture banked in the soil, and not too much, because we could go in and plant, right? We could get our field operations done, but we had a really good profile of soil moisture. And that really helped the crop as the areas that were affected by drought kind of got started and that drought set up.
Yeah, for sure. But it wasn't necessarily an especially hot or warm April and May. I mean, it was a little bit cool, but it didn't cause any undue stress on recently emerged seedlings. So that helped to get the good establishment, from at least from my point of view.
Yeah, I think, we were cool. And in some cases, the continuous cornfields, because there was a lot of residue and we were cold and the soils were staying cool, some of those fields had a slow start and it ended up affecting how they did later in the year. But for the most part, yeah, we had a really nice, cool, but open planting season. And, even though it was kind of cool, the crop came out of it. When we finally got warm in June, we really weren't by middle of June, we weren't very far off of what we would consider ideal kind of crop stage, crop sizing. And, when you and I did the July 4th podcast, we had a lot of head-high corn on July 4th, and that's just what you want to have.
Yeah, exactly. It sets up for a really nice year. So, Wayne, what do you think are those factors that all of us shared in the Rob Seco footprint as we look, from Colorado to Illinois, from North Dakota down through Kansas? What are some things that we did have in common throughout the year?
Well, that early planting. So almost everybody got to take advantage of that early planting opportunity. And we had a near immediate shift from corn to beans. So both crops went in very timely. Everybody had a very challenging spray season for both crops. It was just so often windy. And when it wasn't windy, it was dead still. So we didn't get the optimal kind of spraying conditions to do a good job with our post applications. And that made it timeliness on post application treatments kind of difficult. We all did kind of get warm in June at the same time. So when we came out of that cool May, we had a nice warm June, and it kind of went into the early part of July. One of the interesting things at the end of the year that we saw, and it was fairly common across the whole area, was that, usually full season hybrids, full season soybean varieties, they top the plots, and a lot of times there's a kind of a sort by maturity, and that didn't necessarily happen this year. It did in some places, but in many cases, also in some cases, I should say, not many, the full season hybrids didn't always win. It was that kind of set of hybrids right behind them. So, for example, if you were in an area that could go from 112 to 115, 18 day, the 113, 14 day hybrids sometimes were the best instead of that 118 day. So we didn't always see the fullest season product win.
Yeah. Now, this is kind of where we start to break away on those commonalities in the season. But what are some things during the season that only some geographies experience, but not others that really differentiated performance across the Rob Seco footprint?
Yeah, and the first thing that kind of started to set up was those drought conditions that really kind of followed the I-80 corridor and the I-70 corridor all the way from the Rocky Mountains and then got more and more intense and kind of extended into Iowa and Illinois even. So we had a big chunk of the center of our footprint that really happened to fight some significant droughts, and a lot of places were at 50% of normal growing season precipitation, some cases a little lower, some a little higher. So just depended on whether or not they were lucky enough to catch a little rainstorm. So that was a really important kind of factor that affected a part of our corn footprint and soybean footprint. Now, if you go north of there, that's where we kind of had ideal rainfall. So a lot of parts of Minnesota, not all of Minnesota, some parts in North Dakota and northern South Dakota had really nice rainfall. And like I said, never got too wet. In those parts of the world, too much rain and saturated soils and ponding, that can often be a yield limiting factor. And they had some big rains, but they didn't stay saturated for long periods of time. And so that kind of stood out as a very different component of what was going on in our footprint. And I call that part of the world near perfect because, boy, when the yields came in, they were really good. And then we had that huge wind event. We had some smaller wind events in several areas, western Minnesota. We had northwestern Minnesota, I should say. We had some wind in Nebraska that caused some damage. But boy, we had a windstorm in Iowa that really changed the crop for people, especially the corn crop. Not so much the bean crop, but really changed the corn crop that they were going to be able to harvest. And in some of those areas, they had not been as affected by the drought, so that crop was looking really nice. And that derecho really did a number on a lot of acres.
Yes, it did. And in fact, you showed an image to our company as we did the year in review company-wide that really illustrates from a satellite image just the breadth of the damage across Iowa. You look at this image and it's you can see right where Des Moines and Ames are, and you see a swath of lighter colored green that just indicates downed corn.
Yeah, all the way from, kind of even up in around the Carroll, Iowa area, all the way down to and across to the Quad Cities and pretty big north to south. It was a devastating storm. Really dominated the experience of 2020 for the farmers in that part of the world.
So Wayne, we saw a lot of drought in a lot of areas, and you touched on this a little bit already, but why did the crop die so fast in some of those geographies where August was just so dry? I mean, I think you've mentioned before that humidity had a lot to do with this.
Yeah, we were in a drought, and usually in a drought, you have a pretty large toll on water demand for the plants. And this year we stayed humid enough that water demand really kept the plants hanging on. Both corn and soybeans did very well through a good chunk of July and August with very minimal precipitation because the water demand of the atmosphere. So what drives water loss from plants is how thirsty the atmosphere is. And when we got a lot of humidity, then the atmosphere, the air above the crop isn't that thirsty. So those plants don't have to give up as much water as they would if the conditions were lower in humidity. And when we saw things really go backwards, right toward the end of August and the early part of September, and a lot of cornfields turned brown pretty fast, and a lot of soybean fields kind of took on that kind of turquoise gray color pretty fast. And what happened was we lost that humidity. And we had already depleted our soil profiles so severely that once that humidity went away and that evaporative demand was increased, those plants just didn't have the water resources to be able to handle that. So we did see some premature death. Now, it didn't end up affecting the crop. You could tell it happened because if you broke ears in those fields that weren't able to handle that low humidity continuation of the drought late in the season, you could see a little bit of shrunkenness at the bottom of the kernel, a little bit of chalkiness in color. But I think in most cases that really fast, sudden death, it probably didn't change the yield more than 3 to 5%. So the crop was almost done when that happened. And really that was an ideal situation for as low a rainfall as we were in for that humidity to keep that crop continuing to grow. And that's why we had farmers in very low rainfall areas that harvested a much nicer corn crop and soybean crop than they expected to harvest for the amount of rain that we got. In fact, in some of the fields I've calculated, 10 and 12 bushels per inch. And that's a goal in an irrigated field, is trying to produce 10 bushels per inch. And we had some of these rain-fed farms that produced as much as 12 bushels per inch of precipitation, and of course, including water stored in the profile. So it was a pretty amazing year in spite of the drought conditions in the central kind of that I-70, I-80 corridor.
Absolutely. Yeah, we were very surprised. We've gotten a number of comments from growers about the beans are a lot better than they expected them to be because rain in August makes grain. So Wayne, if we could sum up kind of what we saw across the growing season this year, what are those 5 to 10 overall factors that we would use to sum up that really impacted what this year's crop ended up looking like? And then from there, how can we use that to go into 21? But I'll let you sum up those factors in 2020 first.
Yeah, well, so we got our field work done. We got early planting. That was a great help, other than those few places that where we had 2019 crop in the field and way up north where it stayed a little bit too wet. But for the most part, everybody got their field work done. They got their planting in at a good time, and that really set the crop up nicely. We had an early harvest, and we were able to get a lot of the beans out of the way really quick, and before the corn was really ready. And then we got right into the corn as it was ready. So I think the early harvest really helped get as much of that crop into the bin, out of the field and into the bin or to the elevator as possible. We did lose a little bit of yield because the soybeans got so dry so quick that you just couldn't keep up with them, and so we lost a little weight because the soybeans were so dry, and that was the disadvantage of that really nice open and early harvest. In those droughty areas, Jim, I don't think we've really broken the drought, and we've got some indications that we're starting to get back on a more normal rainfall pattern, but we still have to break this drought. So I think one of the things a lot of our customers are thinking about is, gosh, do I need to go to a really drought tolerant hybrid next year? And I think that it's always good to have drought tolerance. I think especially if you can get drought tolerance in a hybrid that still does the other things you need, because it could rain next year. We could have foliar diseases, so you need to also think about, well, if I'm in a situation where gray leaf spot's often a problem, or northern corn leaf blight, I need to look at that. If I'm in an area where if it rains, I can have some ponding, well then, yeah, I want drought tolerance, but I also need to have a ability to perform in saturated soils, right, or poorly drained soils. So when you think about, I think, what would be the best decision on products for next year, we have had two very different growing seasons kind of back to back. Early planting this year, late planting a year ago, a lot of rain a year ago, not so much rain, even drouthy this year. I think what you look for is those hybrids that did well across both years. And so you go back and say, what did I learn in 19, and which products really handled 19 well? And a lot of those products also did pretty well in 20. So I think that gives you a really nice start on how you can best prepare yourself for what 21 is going to bring, because we don't know what's going to happen in 21, right? We still got to, it could be wet, it could be dry, it could be cool, it could be hot, we don't know yet. So I think period of year performance hybrids that have the agronomic characteristics to address the needs you have on the farm, and those are the hybrids you want to focus on for 2021.
Absolutely. Yeah. So just to kind of summarize overall, 2020 was a very, very interesting year that started out fantastic, but then it got interesting throughout the year. But based on what we saw in 2020, we may have in some geographies a little less of a soil moisture profile going into 2021, depending on what we get over the next 6-7 months. But we could end up being dry, or wet. It just depends on the year. So as you're making your decisions for 2021, utilize multi-year data to best suit what your needs are and what your anticipated needs may be going into the year. So anything else you want to add, Wayne?
No, I think that's a really good summary. So we'll hope for a less interesting 2021, right? And a little bit more normal and a little bit more predictable weather events across the whole footprint, rather than these wide swings in what we experienced.
Absolutely. Well, Wayne, thank you so much for joining us for this episode.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Always fun.
Yeah. So as always, be sure to tune in on the 1st and 15th of every month for new episodes. And until then, stay field ready.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Rob Seco Field Ready Podcast. Join us next time to be field ready.